Now we have Joshua Eichen for the last presentation in this panel. Afterwards, we will have obviously the Q&A, right? So we'll be hearing Josh talking about struggles to the state, lessons from 16th century São Tomé.
Up? Can you hear me? So thank you. When you only have 15 minutes, it's not necessarily the best use of your time to start with introductory remarks, but since we have a little more, I'm going to indulge myself slightly and therefore make all you sit through it as well. There's sort of my idea for sort of thinking about São Tomé and sort of 16th century is conditioned in some ways by the fact to roll back slightly. This is going to be fairly somewhat discussion of slavery, sort of the beginning of the slave trade. And in the same way it was raised in one of the keynote sessions, we have sort of real problems of representation, of sort of the limits of what can be represented, how it can be represented, sort of, and I think that's just sort of something that I'm beginning to struggle with, and I think it sort of shows up in all of this as well. And so as we sort of sit in this present, I want to sort of like look back to the 16th century because in some ways we're sort of confronting like a single crisis with sort of like the mythical Hydra. It's a single beast, but one with many heads. We're sort of suffering a crisis of social reproduction with $1.5 trillion in student debt just in the United States, a lack of affordable housing, which San Francisco is either one, if not the sort of epicenter of in the United States, lack of quality childcare and quality schools, decades of stagnating wages, and our sort of present ongoing extinction event, or as it was recently put, humanity is about to kill 1 million species in a globe-spanning murder-suicide, which is not a bad headline, and also, of course, in this crowd, I think I can uncontroversially say it's, of course, not humanity, but capital, because otherwise that would be the first question. I know this peanut gallery. And the second part is this murder-suicide, as it's unfolding, is not evenly distributed in its cause nor its effects. It follows a global color line, not untraced, but first traced by, not unchanged, but first traced by capital more than 500 years ago. And I want to stress sort of one place in particular for its conjunctions of forces and processes that work there, because the details matter. It's not just sort of the articulation, and I think one of the things that's often missing from a lot of the conversation, because we have another sort of red, I used to know the fancy word for 400 years, but what's considered sort of the first records of Africans arriving on what's now colonial North America took place 400 years ago this August. The problem with that is, of course, most of those histories don't really question, well, what were they doing on a Dutch ship to begin with? And what technologies, practices did they build on? So even sort of constructing the United States and its particular history outside of sort of not just sort of the Atlantic trade, but sort of the Atlantic and the Americas is, and that's sort of too partial to, I think, sort of begin to give us better answers, sort of the answers that not only do we need, but they're the ones we deserve. And so as I sort of stress sort of the role of São Tomé, and really as much, not so much unique about it, but sort of its positionality in all the ways I'll get into, it's sort of stressed because this history is still present in so many ways, and the centrality of the state and sort of state effects remain central to thinking about this damage and thinking about undoing it. So sort of question of São Tomé and why São Tomé, but first really where São Tomé, because as most people can't really find it on a map. So as we can sort of see, this is a representation from the early 16th century, and so again, to sort of stress a point from another plenary, just how long parts of humanity's imagination has been global. We can see large contours of the Indian Ocean, coast of Brazil. Placement is not necessarily put them, but just sort of how many pieces were already in place that early. But I want to sort of focus on Southern Africa because that's where the story is going to take place. So here at the bottom, you can sort of see the Cape of Good Hope, and as we move up, and this is not quite the resolution I want, but it's what we have. And so this is where São Tomé is, and it's actually fairly close. It's just the island itself actually does intersect the equator, and it's about, if I'm remembering correctly, about 100 miles or so offshore from what is now Gabon, but where the currents run, it's basically unpopulated when the Portuguese found it. Basically, the reason why São Tomé is important, it was a key node in the emerging Atlantic slave trade, first to Europe and then to the Americas, because it's sort of, in a way, that a lot of narratives unfold. It's like Europe, Africa, slave trade, boom. No questions, just sort of flattened out. And I think it's important to sort of slow those down and talk about how that's built unevenly, piece by piece. That's sort of part of the general project, but I'll just be sort of talking about a piece of that. Most importantly for voices, this was the first sugar colony with an enslaved African labor force, which I'll get into why that's particularly of interest or importance. And it was also one of the first European colonies that wasn't majority European. So as the global color line is being constructed, it's not just sort of like how to like integrate these groups, but actually make them productive in a value, as Eric Dussel is sort of focused on. All right, there we go. So this is the actual network of how the East Atlantic slave was constructed. You can see we're going to sort of focus in, that's São Tomé on the bottom, and how it articulated with the Gulf of Guinea, Kingdom of Congo. And you can sort of see how this sort of network was built to transport enslaved Africans to Iberia. And so, as the second point, though, what they sort of, and just talk about, to give you a scale of how early this is happening. By 1516, in like a single year, more than 4,000 enslaved men, women, and children passed through this island. And this may have been an unusually high amount because there were ongoing wars in Benin and Congo, but a contemporary who actually did that count basically said, not only is this profitable for the crown, we can probably raise it, if we had more ships, we could probably raise it by more than 50%. And again, up to about 6,500, and this is a growth, identifying this as a growth industry. And so the next part is basically São Tomé, 1516, there's maybe 2 sugar mills at this point, but things are just getting started. And so to sort of talk about why sugar is important, it has a particular place sort of in in histories of capitalism, particularly histories that recognize the importance of the colonies and sort of the global and globalizing phenomenon from the beginning. So this is what sugar starch actually looks like. This is a representation from the sort of 17th century, and as I said, it's this classic object for thinking about the relation between industrialization and capital, for thinking about slavery and capitalism. Eric Williams, C.R.L. James, Fernando Ortiz are just a few of the people who sort of have thought the centrality of sugar in the history of capital. And when we talk about it, I want to sort of talk about the materiality and sort of what's going on to the best. So basically, sugar is a cane. It grows roughly about sort of 10 feet tall. It's then cut and it's milled to release the juice. And once it's cut and released, it needs to be milled within about 24 to 48 hours, as what's going on with palm, because it's also sugars, I assume, and if it basically has to be boiled soon after that. And if it's not boiled, it'll ferment, and then it all becomes useless. So the very materiality of it imposes a sort of what's later described as a factory in the field, because you have to have a very sharp labor discipline to make all of this work. And so this representation from the late 16th century is actually wrong in all sorts of key ways if you're going to try to reconstruct the actual processes of sugar production. But it does sort of capture the two things that exist in so much of the population, which is sugar plus slavery, and it's always been sort of sugar plus slavery. So this is a representation of basically over the last millennia or longer, what basically be tracked, where it sort of passed through the Mediterranean. But as I sort of said, it didn't look like this, but more like this. And so basically it's much more, it's skilled labor, it's sort of the laborers are clearly clothed. We're not sure what where the inspiration for this image is taken from, but just sort of give you the understanding that there's a sort of particular moment where basically Madeira, which was before São Tomé, was the leading sugar colony. And on this island there was slavery. There was the gauchos from the Canary Islands, there were Moroccans, there were sub-Saharan Africans, but it was concentrated in urban areas. It was basically connected to reproductive labor. There was no concentration of wealth, there was no concentration, there was no basically pairing of slavery and sugar at this point. And so it's here in São Tomé where things happen. And the reason why it's happened seems to be because geography matters. Its location off the coast of Africa, the tides there basically make it very hard to reach by boat. So it's completely unpopulated. It also has a lot of rain, because you need water to grow sugar. And because if you look, basically, it's not on this map, but Cape Verde Islands were also populated, but were totally dry. And so ended up serving also as a collection point for slaves on the way to Europe and the Americas, but basically given the materiality of the region, ended up concentrating in cattle. So sort of the geography matters. So sort of as we think about the settlement, so basically there were sort of three groups that were used to populate this island, which was totally unpopulated when the Portuguese arrived in 1493, when sort of settlement began and stuck. So it was granted to a donatario, Alvaro de Caminha, and it was with him that took hold. So basically in July of that year, a new charter for the island was written, which was how the Portuguese populated their islands. They basically wrote up sort of saying, these are the economic privileges, this is what we want to support, how we're going to divide systems of justice, rules of the state. Basically they granted Caminha a jurisdiction in criminal and civil cases, and basically a right to levy a tax on sugar mills, and specified how land would be brought into cultivation. He also basically gave Caminha, he had about 4 months to set sail, and basically they let him go into the jails and take the degrados, or the disgraced, or basically the criminals who were exiled. And from what the records we have, they were not particularly picky about who they took, and they let him take wherever they wanted. And for decades afterwards, Portuguese continued to exile criminals to São Tomé, and then later were sent to Brazil, which is interesting. So the other group, the next group that was sent was populated through the use of Jewish children. Like I said, this whole story is basically just horrors upon horrors upon horrors, just horrors all the way down. So this was 1493, and the number of things of world ecological importance happened in 1492, and one of them was the fall of Granada, the last Islamic kingdom in Iberia, and with that, a number of Jews decided to make their way to Portugal, paying an entry tax. And at some point, as they're thinking about how they're going to sit in São Tomé, and there's maybe some questions about, they're worrying about sort of the de-Christianization of Portugal, they come up with the idea of taking Jewish children, baptizing them, and sending them to São Tomé to be raised in the faith. And in the end, they do this with about 2,000 of them altogether. So, cool. Next group. So, do not. So to care for these children, or about every 5 of them, they were enslaved Africans were gifted to them, basically a male and a female for every 5 children, enslaved Africans, were also gifted to Portuguese settlers. And basically, all of that sort of combined to these are the groups that settled. And sort of beyond the island of São Tomé, each of these groups experienced the organized violence of the state, having been kidnapped under different circumstances. So as part of that, basically disease was, of course, sort of rampant, probably malaria. A few years after the Calminho settlement, there's a letter where basically it's signed by all the heads of household that are on the island at that point, and basically saying his cousin should take over running the island, and there's only about 65 heads of household sign it, which is basically representative of about half the people who sailed with him are now probably dead. So just massive sort of morality. There's even in the 1530s, there's a papel nuncio from the Catholic Church, basically against the Portuguese government, saying you're violating the church injunction against sentencing clerics to death because you're sending them to São Tomé, and the expectation is they're just going to die there. So, and then there's the question of with any slave society manumission. And so one of the interesting things that happened is through sort of in 1515, there is a mass manumission of the female slaves who were granted to the original settlers, the Jewish children, and the other slaves, and they were given their collective freedom. There's clearly some sort of conflict because 2 years later the male slaves are also given their freedom, and so are their children. And so what I'm trying to sort of get at here is Portugal is basically Portugal set this up. We have sort of to begin to think about São Tomé's place and how all these different groups, enslaved Africans, Jewish settlers, there's children, criminals, basically ended up struggling through the state for the categories of who could serve, what sort of classification they had, as the Portuguese sort of delegated authority, and also encouraged certain things. It was set up as a network in the slave trade. It was, from the beginning in the charters, this was going to be a sugar growing island. And so basically the questions that I think we sort of should return to sort of over and over again as we think about our contemporary moment is the question of basically who can own property. This was a time of incredible social mobility. Basically formerly exiled criminals are rising up to sort of the heads of government, seeking collective things. There's an account of a very old African owning a tremendous number of slaves, one of the largest landowners in the 1520s as well. The question of who can be property, which is faded to some degree, but not as much as we would like in our present, and the question of what can be property, what forms of land, what forms of investment, and basically who can serve in government and governmental bodies, including militias, which continue to be a problem or a fact of life all the way through. So I believe that just about closes out my time. And so I would just sort of say, I think it's important over and over again to stress sort of the questions of the state, which I think are closer to us, and this is in this more left space than many other academic conferences I've been to, so we can ask that question a little more honestly, but also how does it articulate to production? Because in looking at slavery, slavery is not just this blanket thing that is the same thing over 400 years, like somebody LeQuant sort of intimates. It actually maps on the reproductive and productive regimes, and the rates of death map on in very particular ways. Sugar is particularly deadly for its intensity of work, for the disease environments it creates. And with that, I will say thank you very much.